we're in chapter 18 and we're down close to the end of it. But just sort of review, Jesus had come to the Garden of Gethsemane. It doesn't say Gethsemane. Well, it does in the other places. But he had come to the garden, and Judas had met him there with a band, and they had arrested him, and they took him to Annas, who was the high priest that year, and he went through that's where one of the soldiers slapped him in the face because he said that, they asked him about his doctrine. He said, well, I've taught openly in the synagogues, in the temple, and, asked the people that heard me speak. And they slapped him in the face. And then after that, he was taken to the hall of Caiaphas. And that's where, yes, the hall of judgment. And it says Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. And that's where right before this, Peter had denied him those 3 times, and the rooster crowed. And Peter, of course, was sorry for that. And then he went to Pilate. And Pilate asked them in verse 29, what accusation or what are you charging him with? Why are you bringing him to me? And they said, well, if he wasn't a malefactor, and a malefactor is simply a thief or somebody that's broke the law, we would not have delivered him unto you. Then Pilate, I think Pilate knew pretty well that they were doing this for envy, because here in the book of John, in verse 38, and then in chapter 19, and verse 3, and also in verse 6, Pilate says, I find no fault in him. Now, Pilate, again, was trying, he thought that if he just would persecute Jesus some, he could get out of this. And we know this because I want you to turn back to Luke chapter 23, and I think it's important that we read this. And then when we study John, we can see how Pilate felt about this. Now, we'll go back up to verse 8 because this is what Peter asked about last week. When Pilate heard that Herod was in Jerusalem, when Herod saw it, he sent Jesus to Herod. When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he had hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him in many words, but Jesus answered him not. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod and his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. The same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. Now, I want you to notice what Herod did from here on, or Pilate did from here on. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, said unto them, You have brought this man unto me, that one that perverteth the people. And behold, I have examined him before you, and have found no fault in the man touching those things whereof you accuse him of. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent him to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. Notice what he said. I will therefore chastise him and release him. And for of necessity, he must release one of them at the feast. And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who for certain seditions made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake to them again, but they cried, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And notice, he said the third time, Why? What evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were in instant and with loud voices requiring that he might be crucified, and the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed, and Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And so Pilate was doing the very best he could to get out of this. He knew that Jesus was an innocent man. He knew that he didn't do anything. He knew it was a matter, that's why he told them earlier, if it's a matter of your law, you take him and judge him. And they said, well, we can't put a man to death. You know, the Jews weren't allowed to put somebody to death. But, and so Pilate knew, and he tried his best to get out of this. Now, we're going to see here in the book of John the reason why he eventually gave in to him. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But it was because the Jews says, if you say that Jesus is king, there's no other king but Caesar. And it put Pilate in a situation where he had to give in for his job. He was afraid then when they said that. And so notice then, he began to question him. Pilate asked him in verse 33, we studied this a little bit last week, art thou the king of Jews? Jesus answered, sayest thou this of thyself, or did others tell it to thee? Pilate said, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And then Jesus told him, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, my kingdom is not a physical kingdom. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, and I should be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. And Pilate realized then that Jesus was no threat to the Roman Empire. It was a spiritual kingdom. It was something that had to do with the Jews, and he knew that, and he was trying then to satisfy the Jews enough in order not to crucify Jesus. And notice then, Pilate said unto him, art thou king then? And Jesus said, thou sayest I am a king, to this end was I born. For which cause I came into the world, I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. And so Jesus is talking about the fact that when he was born, you remember, it was prophesied that the star during the time of Herod, of the father Herod, and that the wise men came and he was the king. And then, of course, Herod tried to get rid of him, and he wound up killing the children in Jerusalem. And so Jesus then says, those that hear my voice is the truth. And Pilate said, what is truth? Now, I don't know if Pilate really wanted to know what truth was or not. You know, somebody like him would never hardly speak the truth. They would do what they wanted to. And so, and when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said to them, I find in him no fault at all. He is telling them, he didn't, notice he said, but you have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? And then they cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber, and we read in the other Gospels that Barabbas was also guilty of going against the government. He was a murderer, a robber, one that did insurrection against the government, and so he was truly a hardened criminal. And they were crying then, release Barabbas and kill Jesus. So we see then, and when we get to chapter 19, then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Now this scourging was a very, very difficult thing. You know, the Romans were sort of experts at making people suffer. There's a Roman. Now, a Roman, it was a law that a Roman couldn't be scourged. You remember that? They were going to scourge Paul, and he says, I'm a Roman citizen, and they wouldn't do it. And they were afraid because, if they did it, they would have got in trouble. Well, I mean, they would actually usually take the clothing mostly off of the person and either tie them to the post or tie them down with their limbs spread out and then beat them with rods and whips. A lot of the whips, they would put metal in the end of it so that when they would hit their backs, it would just, split their backs. And a lot of people died from scourging. It was that hard. Now remember, Jesus had been up all night, nothing to eat or drink or anything, as far as we know. He had been up all night at these trials, these mock trials they had, and now they take him and they scourge him. And so it's no wonder. Now, John doesn't mention this, but the others mention it, that when Jesus was carrying the cross, that they compelled Simon of Cyrene to help him bear his cross, because no doubt he was so weak from what they had done to him. And so they were experts at scourging him. Like, for instance, think of these people that were on the cross. And they said, well, we don't want to be on the cross for the seventh day because that's a feast day. And so they sent soldiers out, and soldiers broke their legs. Now, the commentaries I read said they probably had like a sledgehammer and would break their legs. And when I seen it, I thought of that crazy movie I seen one time, Misery or something. Anybody remember seeing that, how that woman broke the legs of that guy? Well, I mean, that's how they were. I mean, can you imagine in such pain of being on that cross and then have somebody break your legs? I mean, they were, like I say, they were what you might say experts at putting out this pain and making somebody suffer as much as they could. And so Jesus then was taken, he was scourged. And then the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put him in a purple robe and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they smote him with their hands. And so, again, this purple robe was a color of royalty, and so they were just mocking it. They put this crown of thorns on and this purple robe, but Pilate then went forth again and said unto the Jews, "Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said unto them, "Behold the man." Now, no doubt he thought, after he had chastised Jesus like this, as we read from the book of Luke, they would let him go. And he had had Jesus beaten and had him mocked and everything, and had him like this. And so he says, here's the man, here he is. But notice, when the chief priest therefore and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said unto them, "Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." In other words, if you want to crucify him, you take him and crucify him. I'll give you evidently the authority. Then Jews answered, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. Remember what his wife had told him from the book of Matthew? Don't have anything to do with this just man. And as a matter of fact, I think Pilate evidently probably knew some of the Jewish customs, because when he wanted to get rid of this, he went and washed his hands in a bowl in water in order to say, I'm free of this, like the Jews would do probably. And so Pilate then, when he heard this, he was more afraid. I mean, he actually was scared because, and especially because these Jews had said, he says he's the Son of God. That would cause him to be even more scared, because here he was, and he knew that Jesus was something special when he interviewed him, when he had him before him. And so he went again into the judgment hall and said unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Where are you from? Or who are you? Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and the power to release thee? In other words, Pilate come in and he spoke to Jesus, and he said, Jesus didn't answer him at all. And he said, Don't you know that I have the power to kill you or to let you go? That power's in my hand. Look what Jesus tells him. Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Talking about the Jews would have the greater sin, the ones that delivered him unto them. Remember what the Jews said when they wanted to crucify him? Let his blood be on who? Us and our children. Yeah. And certainly it was. It was. And so notice then, from thenceforth, Pilate sought to release him. He was still trying to release him. He thought that he had done enough. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. Notice then, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover about the 6th hour. And he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto him, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered and said, We have no king but Caesar. And delivered he them unto them to be crucified, delivered him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. Pilate did his best to try to get out of this. He thought, if I just chastise him, if I just beat him and present him, then that'll be enough for him. But when they came with this thing that there's another king besides Caesar, then they were rooting in on what Pilate, got to understand, these leaders were politicians, and they're going to go where the majority of the people go. And so then they were crying out, and Pilate then had no choice. When they said, We have no king but Caesar, he delivered them to be crucified, and they took Jesus away. And so Jesus then is told. Now, remember too, that Jesus had said several times about the death he would die. He said, I think in chapter 7 or 8, he says, You'll know who I am when I am lifted up. I know in chapter 12 he says, And if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me. And so, again, in this, when they said it's not lawful for us to put anybody to death, the Jews did, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die, because it already had been prophesied that he would die on the cross, and he would die at the hands of the Gentiles. And so Jesus then, notice, he bearing his cross, went forth into the place that's called the place of the skulls, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Golgotha. What else is this place called, by the way? Calvary. And it's only in the book of Luke that you read it. I told her that before we left home. No, I didn't. All right, and since so, and where they crucified him, and two others with him, one on either side, one and Jesus in the middle, in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And so we find out that he wrote this title in 3 different languages, because during the time of the Passover, there would be people from all nations in Jerusalem celebrating that Passover, and some spoke different languages, and they all would be able to read what the language was, who it was. And they did this to the criminals that they crucified. They would put maybe their name up and what they were guilty of. I suppose the thieves there, they probably put their names up and said they were guilty of being thieves or whatever. But anyway, and the title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, in all 3 languages. So the chief priests didn't like this. They came to Pilate and they said, write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. In other words, they didn't want it. But Pilate answered and said, what I have written, I had written. He would not change it. And so you can see then that Jesus was crucified. Now, it's talked about the fact that probably he was crucified more than likely. Mark says it was about the 3rd hour of the day. Here it says about the 6th hour. So it probably somewhere between, they usually called the time between 9 and 12 o'clock in the morning, the 3rd hour during that time. And then from 12 on, it would be the 6th hour to 3 o'clock. And so probably between 9 and 12 o'clock, Jesus was nailed to the cross. And he was on the cross until about the 9th hour. And then he died and was taken off. He's probably on the cross approximately 6 hours. But they wrote this over the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And he wrote it in 3 languages. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. Now this was like a bounty for the soldiers. When they would crucify, they were allowed to take the clothing of the people. And not only did they get paid to be a soldier, but they got the clothing of the people. And so there was 4 soldiers evidently that took part in this, and they parted his garments. But there was one of the garments that was one piece thing. And so rather than tear, notice, they said, therefore among themselves, let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it should be, that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Now they didn't realize they were fulfilling the scriptures, because the scriptures talked about they would cast lots for his garments. And that's what they did over this, evidently, maybe the outer garment that he had, I don't know. exactly what it was, but anyway, it was a one-piece thing. It would be no good to them if they divided it in 4 pieces, because it was a one-piece garment. And so they cast lots for this. The scriptures might be fulfilled, which said, they parted my garments among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things, therefore, the soldiers did. Now, in the other Gospels, it talks about not only what the soldiers, but the centurion. Anybody remember what the centurion said? Truly, this is the Son of God. Isn't that amazing that the Jews couldn't see that, and somebody that's not even, that's a Gentile, that a Roman soldier could see that truly this is the Son of God.
I think Pilate saw it.
Huh?
I think Pilate saw it, and he knew it.
He probably did. He probably did. Because he wanted to see some miracle he done. He wanted to see some things. He wanted to put him on the show. But
kill him. I mean, he knew something was different.
Yes.
There's no way a Roman official like that would think twice about killing a Jew.
No.
I mean, he stopped 3 or 4 times. And those were the most prideful people of that time.
Yeah.
Jimmy, why did the Jews say that they couldn't kill him?
They had a law that, see, they were under Roman authority. Mm-hmm. Now they had a law where they could
Had a law, or
they could beat them. They could give them like 39 stripes, save one, and stuff like that. The Romans allowed that, but they could not put anybody to death, because the Romans were the only ones that could do that.
okay.
That's why the Jews.
Follow God's law.
Notice verse 31. Then Pilate said unto him, take ye him, and of chapter 18 I'm talking about. Take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. And so
That was the Roman law, not the Jewish.
yes, that was the Roman law. They weren't allowed to do that because the Romans controlled them, and only Romans could sentence people to death.
Okay.
Now, they broke that law when they stoned Stephen.
Yeah.
And but you know, the next sentence there's this, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Well, if he had died a Jewish death, they would have stoned him to death.
Right.
They took up stones several times to kill him, and he went through the midst of them. But the Roman law for death was crucifixion.
Right. Okay.
And so that's
I
why.
didn't know why they said it, because I knew they had a law where they could kill them or stone them, and so I didn't know if they were talking about their law or.
Yes, their law was stoning. The Romans' law was crucifixion.
Okay.
And so anyway, they parted his garments, these 4 soldiers, and the one garment that was a complete garment, they did not cut it up. They cast lots for it. Yes?
Here's a good example of implication and necessary inference in verse 23, because how many soldiers were there?
It doesn't say, but it said that
4. It's implied.
implied that there were 4, yes.
Absolutely.
Because they each took a part. Yes. Okay. When it said they made 4 parts to every soldier a part, that sort of implies that there's 4 soldiers. And so you're right. And so Jesus then was crucified. He was. They had took his garments, and now notice while he was on the cross, now standing by the cross of Jesus, his mother's sister, and Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene.
How many women were there?
4.
4? Marcy and I had an argument last night coming back.
What's not an argument?
Well,
Who?
not an argument.
Who won?
She did.
Depends on your answer.
I said there were 3 Marys. There are 3 Marys, but there were 4 women there.
Okay. All right.
Doesn't it seem like, though, Now there stood by the cross Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas. Could Mary be, the wife of Cleophas, be Mary's sister?
No, I think if you check the other Gospels, and you got to look at this, his mother's sister, I think, was Salome, the mother of James and John. If you look at the other Gospels, it talks about Salome being at there. And so, and many think that Jesus and John, and James and John were cousins. And they think that's why that Jesus gave this authority to John, because he was the next of kin, evidently, that would be responsible to take care of his mother. He might have, but you remember, they didn't believe in him. And so later on they did. But anyway, we'll look at these things next week, next Sunday, about the things that he said from the cross. Jesus said 7 different sayings from the cross. In the book of John, he says 3, and Luke 3, and Matthew and Mark, he only says 1.